are tuning into Art of Citizenry Podcast. I am your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, I want to welcome you. For those who have listened before, I'm honored to have you here with me again. Art of Citizenry is a community-supported podcast dedicated to decolonizing storytelling, the spaces we occupy, and collective liberation. Being listener-supported allows me to have unfiltered and nuanced conversations that challenge how power plays out when discussing and addressing social, economic, climate, and geopolitical justice. We unpack history to really identify ways we can build a more equitable future, one that is restorative and just. To support this podcast, please give it 5 stars on your favorite listening app and be sure to subscribe. I'm also now on Patreon, so if you find this podcast insightful, please consider contributing to it by visiting patreon.com/Manpreet Kaur. Any support you can offer helps. During this episode, we will be discussing the recent Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Collectively, we are grieving the loss of our bodily autonomy. Conversations around abortion rights and U.S. law are complicated, not because they have to be, but because we live in a society rooted in patriarchal misogyny that has historically and continues to believe in maintaining control over women's bodies. In May of 2021, the Supreme Court agreed to review a lower court's decision to strike down a Mississippi state law that banned abortions after 15 weeks, which is well before the 24-week fetal viability measure set forth by Roe v. Wade. Though the law was clearly unconstitutional, Mississippi lawmakers passed the measure fully expecting it to be challenged in hopes that the case would be taken on by the 6-3 majority conservative Supreme Court, an imbalance that only happened in the last presidential term. As expected, the state law was challenged by the Jackson Women's Health Organization abortion clinic out of Jackson, Mississippi, the only abortion clinic in the state of Mississippi. At the heart of the most recent case, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the single question being answered by the courts was if bans on all pre-viability abortions are unconstitutional. In other words, are states able to ban abortions before the 24-week precedent that Roe v. Wade had set? As we are all well aware, the court ruled to overturn Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, stating that pregnant people do not have the constitutional right to an abortion. Overturning Roe v. Wade is the direct result of a patriarchal worldview that recognizes Christian morality as the only moral compass that is allowed to define social norms, one that denies individuals, particularly pregnant people, autonomy over their own body and their own health. The Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade will only further exacerbate existing inequities, disproportionately impacting those already marginalized by systems of oppression: people of color, poor people, people residing in rural regions, among others. Wealthy, upper-middle-class individuals who have the resources and ability to travel to a state where abortion remains legal will remain the only ones who have access to safe abortions. This is what it means to hold privilege and hold power within a classist society. Let's be clear. Abortions will not stop. Only safe abortions will. And we will see an increase in complications and deaths when physicians are not part of the process. When alcohol was banned during the Prohibition period, we saw a significant increase in the amount of unsafe alcohol production that poisoned and killed many individuals due to a lack of regulations and oversight. If something is supposedly not happening, you cannot address it. Without protections and regulations in place, we are creating unsafe environments for further harm and inequity to manifest. To truly value life, there needs to be an increase in paid maternity leave, childcare assistance, free preschool, and everyone needs to have access to safe housing, healthy food, and a strong education. That is pro-life. Access to safe abortions is a conversation that requires us to unpack not just the importance of Roe v. Wade, but all the other ways in which the United States of America has chosen to make access to healthcare more difficult for pregnant people, particularly those who navigate multiple intersections of systemic oppression. I live in a state where abortions remain legal. However, that doesn't mean that they are accessible to everyone within the state. Understanding these nuances is important to understanding the reality we are fighting against and the future we are fighting for. This decision is not about protecting lives. It is about control and denying agency for women, for pregnant people, for patients, and for trained medical professionals. Abortions, like any other medical treatment, are part of essential health care. Denying essential health care is unjust, and denying safe abortions only puts those most vulnerable at further harm. If the U.S. truly believes that no person should be deprived of their liberty, access to health care, one that includes safe abortions, must be considered the human right that it is. During this episode, I am joined by Dr. Allison Berry, a family physician, a mother, and a trained abortion provider. She graduated from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and received her master's from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She currently serves as a county health officer in Washington State. Dr. Berry's views expressed during this episode are her own. They have not been vetted by any of the organizations she currently works for and do not represent an official statement on their behalf. For medical providers such as Dr. Berry, coming out as an abortion provider is very risky to their safety. So before we get started, I want to thank her for her time, compassion, bravery, and for sharing her expertise with us, because it is important that we humanize abortions and give voice to our medical experts. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Berry.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
As a physician, you wear many hats. Can you share with us a bit about your work?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Allison Berry. I am a family physician. And as with many of us, I'm actually a trained abortion provider. So it's a normal part of our training to learn how to provide abortions. And I have provided quite a few over the course of my career. In the last couple of years, I've been primarily focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic, and I have been the county health officer for Clallam and Jefferson counties as well.
So let's start by setting the stage. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant person's liberty to choose to have an abortion. This landmark ruling challenged the individual abortion laws set by various states and made abortion legal at the federal level, above and beyond the state level. The case of Roe v. Wade was initially brought forth in 1969 by Norma McCorvey, known in the case as Jane Roe, a woman who lived in Texas and wanted an abortion but could not have one because it was illegal in Texas, unless it was absolutely necessary to save the life of the pregnant person. The lawsuit was filed against her local district attorney, Henry Wade, hence Roe v. Wade. Considered one of the most controversial cases in constitutional law, the Supreme Court ruled that criminalizing abortions violated the constitutional right of privacy, balancing abortion rights with regulations. Roe v. Wade articulated that states do not have the right to regulate abortions until approximately the end of the first trimester of pregnancy. The court also identified a fetus's viability or ability to live outside the womb at 24 weeks of pregnancy. Can you tell us a bit about the legal standards that were set forth by Roe v. Wade for reproductive rights?
Sure. So Roe v. Wade was a critical decision that basically codified the right to an abortion as long as it was pre-viability. And that was incredibly critical because in much of the United States, it was illegal to access an abortion at that time. And so this made it legal to access those services. A lot of questions remaining about whether or not the procedure could be regulated in any way, but at least codified that it was not constitutional to ban the procedure in any part of the United States.
Earlier, you mentioned the concept of viability. What is fetal viability and why does it matter, especially in the context of conversations on abortion?
There's no firm cutoff of viability, but basically that's when you would expect a fetus to be able to survive outside of their parent. So if that fetus was delivered, we would have a decent shot at keeping them alive in a neonatal ICU. And so for most parts of the United States, that's going to fall around 23 weeks or so, 23, 24, depending on the amount of care availability. But it's not a firm cutoff because it also depends a lot on the medical status of that fetus. So after 24 weeks, there are plenty of fetuses that still will not survive outside of the uterus. Fetuses with significant chromosomal abnormalities that render them not compatible with life outside of the uterus. And I think that's a really critical distinction for people to understand. I think most of us don't understand much about pregnancy. We know that it happens and then babies come, but we don't know all the different complex ways that it can go wrong. And certainly a lot of our lawmakers don't. And so I think that plays into a lot of misconceptions about abortion generally, but specifically about later abortions and what's happening there.
Absolutely. Since Roe v. Wade, anti-abortion groups have continually challenged the court, narrowing its scope with cases including Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey in 1992. How did Planned Parenthood v. Casey change the standard that was set?
Sure. So Planned Parenthood versus Casey basically established prior to that case, it was generally not considered acceptable for the government to heavily regulate abortion if it was pre-viability. So pretty much anything shy of 24 weeks was just left between the patient and their doctor, which is, I would say, how doctors prefer to have these conversations. But with Planned Parenthood versus Casey, they were basically testing the ability of the government to pass regulations dealing with abortion pre-viability and whether or not that was going to be legal. And what that case decided was that basically it is legal or constitutional in the United States for governments to regulate abortions prior to viability if they don't place what's called an undue burden on the pregnant person. The challenge with that, it sounds reasonable, but the challenge with that is who decides what an undue burden is. And what it basically said was, in practice, was that different states could pass regulations limiting access to abortion as long as they didn't fully ban the procedure prior to viability, but they could do a whole lot of other things to limit access to abortion. Things like passing these laws that place such a burden on the clinics that they have to close in many states, in many parts of the country, placing restrictions that really delay access to abortion for pregnant people, which can be really critical. Abortions are very time sensitive. The type of procedure you're eligible for changes over time. And of course, a lot of these restrictions place an undue burden on people living in poverty. They put in place waiting periods, which especially if you're having to drive a long distance and spend the night in a hotel, have a multi-day waiting period, that really places abortion out of reach for people who can't otherwise afford it.
On June 24, 2022, the Supreme Court overruled both Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, effectively allowing states to now ban abortions at the state level. As you mentioned, those who will be most impacted are already incredibly marginalized by the judicial, social, political, and medical systems. What is most concerning for you as a medical provider about this ruling?
I think one of the biggest is, I think, knowing the makeup of the court. Many of us expected there to be some rollback of Roe v. Wade with this court. I think not many of us expected them to truly overturn it. That would make it possible in multiple states in this country to truly ban abortion outright. And in many of these states, they have trigger laws in place that would ban abortion in its entirety, regardless of when it happens, regardless of the circumstances of that pregnancy. So the vast majority of Americans support abortion access in at least some circumstances. But in many states, it would become outlawed entirely. Even in some cases, in cases of ectopic pregnancy, which is a pregnancy that will not become viable and is life-threatening to the pregnant person. But in some of those states, under current regulations, ectopic pregnancies, management of those would be outlawed until they become immediately life-threatening, i.e., until that pregnant person is bleeding out in front of you, which will cause pregnant people to die. So that's the most extreme version, but there's a whole spectrum of incredibly stringent limits that are being placed throughout the country that would dramatically limit access to this procedure under this ruling. Other things that are concerning about it, there are parts of it that are medically inaccurate, which is always concerning in law. There are parts of it that play into anti-abortion stigma. So at some points in the draft, the justice calls abortion providers, doctors, nurses, people like myself, abortionists, which is a term that's used by the anti-abortion crowd as part of a lot of rhetoric that labels people who provide this necessary medical procedure as basically murderers, which is serious because, as we know in this country, many of us have been killed for this work. I know, even making this podcast, that it increases the risk that people will know about me, and that can become quite dangerous for medical providers. And so when we see justices using that kind of language, it only adds fuel to that fire.
Absolutely. And I want to take a moment again to thank you so much for joining me here. I recognize that you are putting your safety at risk. It is truly disheartening that we live in a society where advocating for reproductive rights and our rights as humans to make decisions about our own bodies can be a threat to our lives and livelihoods. So truly, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I did question whether or not I wanted to come out in this way, but I think it's really important as medical providers in particular for us to talk openly about abortion. Abortion is a normal medical procedure. It's a normal part of healthcare. We are trained in residency how to do it, as we are trained in all the other myriad procedures we learn how to do. It's a normal part of reproductive healthcare. And unfortunately, partly because of this climate that we live in, we are taught not to talk about it. Don't tell someone that you provide these services. Otherwise, someone might try to shoot up your clinic. Don't tell someone that you might provide these services. Otherwise, you might lose your funding. You might lose your job. But it's important for us to speak out for our patients about the fact that this is normal. It shouldn't be stigmatized. You shouldn't have to go to a special place to get it. You should be able to get these services the same way you get all other medical services in your family physician's office. But many of us aren't able to do that because of the systems in which we work.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's talk about abortions. We can't talk about abortions without first understanding what they are. So what is an abortion and who can provide it?
So yeah, an abortion provider is someone who provides abortion over the course of their care. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about abortion providers. Many people think that we only do abortions. The vast majority of us are actually family docs like myself. So we deliver babies and do abortions. There's a common misconception that we might just not like children, but we do. So I deliver babies, I do abortions, I have a baby. All of those things are fine. They can all coexist. I know a colleague of mine was continuing to work in the abortion clinic while she was visibly quite pregnant until her due date. And often she would run into people who would ask, how do you do that? And how do you provide abortions while you have this baby? And it just betrayed how strangely people view us, that caring about a fetus would mean that we couldn't possibly provide abortions. And the way she always answered it when she felt like answering it was that, having been pregnant, I know how intense of a commitment this is. I know how this has affected my body, and I cannot imagine forcing this on another human being who doesn't want it. And I can say, having been pregnant myself, I could never force that on another person. It completely changes your entire body, and not just in the simple ways that we think about, but my first trimester, I could barely get up out of bed because I was so fatigued. It is a dramatic effect on your body, and there are serious potential consequences. Coming back to abortion provision. So most of us are just regular docs. Nurse practitioners can provide abortions. Midwives can provide abortions. Many do. And we all consider it a part of our normal care. Just like I'll give you an IUD, just like I'll check that skin lesion on your back. These are all normal parts of my job. As far as what an abortion is, so an abortion is ending a pregnancy. That's all it is. Throughout gestation, there can be indications to end a pregnancy. The most common, by far, 90+% of abortions happen early in pregnancy, so before that 12-week cutoff. So the vast majority are very, very early. At that point, you are dealing with little bundles of cells. You are not dealing with the kind of fetuses that we're used to seeing on the pictures from the anti-abortion groups. The most common abortion that you'll see in these early abortions prior to 12 weeks is a medication abortion. So what that means is you take medication to end your pregnancy. Usually it's a 2 medication combo, so mifepristone and misoprostol. You take them separated in time. There used to be laws that said you had to take them in front of a provider. In some states there still are. You can actually do a medication abortion at home. And so some of my patients prefer that. They prefer to do it at home where they feel most comfortable. Some are trying to hide an abortion from a partner who they don't feel safe with, so it looks like they had a miscarriage. What will happen when you take those medications is the pregnancy stops, and then the misoprostol, the mifepristone, stops the pregnancy. The misoprostol causes your uterus to contract and move the pregnancy out. And so you'll have contractions, you'll have bleeding, and then you'll pass the pregnancy. We do always check back to make sure that you fully pass the pregnancy. Not all medication abortions pass the pregnancy. They're more likely to work the earlier you get them. Follow up with your provider will make sure that your abortion is completed. The next most common is what's called a mechanical abortion. So that is usually up to 12 weeks, can be up to 14 weeks in some areas. And basically what we do in those is we insert into the uterus basically kind of like a thick straw, and we suck the pregnancy out. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to as surgical abortions. I don't like that terminology because it suggests that we're doing some kind of surgery on you, that someone's being cut in some way. We don't do that. It's a mechanical abortion. It's a suction machine. Takes 5 to 15 minutes. It is a 1-day in-office procedure. You don't have to go to a surgical wing. We can do it in a clinic. It does lead to pretty significant cramping. Anytime you put something in the uterus, it leads to cramping. So there is some pain associated with that. But we'll help you through it. We have medication to help you through that process. And then we keep you in the office for a little while so we can observe you, make sure you're doing fine. That's the vast majority of abortions. Many of my patients get their procedure and then because of their circumstances go right back to work or go right back to taking care of kids. And so a lot of times I see that my patients prefer a mechanical abortion because of the demands on the rest of their life. Later abortions in pregnancy are very commonly because of a fetal abnormality or because of a risk to the mother's health. I have certainly done later abortions for parents who desired that pregnancy, but who had really significant health consequences from that pregnancy. We had one woman who was having seizures, and we had to stabilize her seizures and then do her abortion to stop them. There are very significant indications for why people get later abortions. That's a somewhat more complicated procedure, generally done under some degree of anesthesia, and often you need to get to a referral center for those. And so access to those is already limited because it requires significant training to know how to do that kind of abortion. And just like any other medical procedure, you are better at it if you do them frequently. And these are uncommon procedures. And so often you're at a tertiary center like University of Washington or like at Johns Hopkins, where we can provide that level of care.
You mentioned that as a family physician, abortion care and procedures are part of your medical training. If I understand correctly, it is also a procedure that you have the ability to opt out of in your training. Is that the case with other procedures as well, or just abortions?
It is interesting because it is one of the only ones that you can opt out of during training. It's interesting that way. I don't get to choose other procedures I don't want to learn how to do. I think, the conscience provisions are important. We certainly don't want people providing abortion services who don't feel comfortable providing them, if for no other reason than to support the patients receiving that care. I think it would be very hard for them to receive high quality care from someone who doesn't want to do it. But generally, we are taught these procedures in the vast majority of family medicine programs. The challenge actually becomes after residency, finding a place where you're allowed to practice those services. So for myself, I received extensive training in abortion provision, both in medical school and in residency, because it was something I was interested in. So I took additional electives to spend time doing that work. But when I came out of residency, I took a job at a tribal health center, which is a place I love to work. I love serving this population, but we are regulated as a federal facility, which means we're covered under the Hyde Amendment. So even though we have multiple providers within our facility who are willing to provide these services, skilled at providing these services, we can't do it in-house because we're covered under federal rules that make it impossible for federal facilities and also tribal facilities to provide this service, which of course disproportionately impacts tribal citizens who are disproportionately impacted by so many of our country's regulations. Similarly, federally qualified health centers, which serve as a safety net for some of the poorest citizens in our country, also are not allowed to provide these services. So we have a local federally qualified health center here in Clallam County, and I know their providers, they're excellently trained in abortion services. They want to provide these services to their patients, and they can't because of the Hyde Amendment. And so what actually is one of the bigger limiting factors, at least in a rural area like this, is legislation like that keeps us from practicing within our own home clinics. We want our patients to be able to access the full spectrum of care with us, so they don't have to get labeled or go to some place where they're going to get chased by protesters. We want them to be able to see the doctors they know, especially in a time like this, but we often can't because of that kind of legislation.
I really appreciate you sharing that perspective with us. It's so important for us to realize that even within states where abortions are protected, equitable access to care, including reproductive care and abortions, is still incredibly difficult. You mentioned the Hyde Amendment, which was passed just a few years after Roe v. Wade and was brought forth by anti-abortion congressional member Henry J. Hyde. Since 1976, the Hyde Amendment has been reenacted every year. Can you tell us about what is set forth by the Hyde Amendment and how you have seen that impact the care people receive?
Yeah, so basically the Hyde Amendment was originally drafted as kind of a compromise legislation, which basically said that we won't spend federal funds on abortion care, which can sound like a reasonable thing until you see the extension of it, which includes things like in many rural areas, many tribal centers, many areas that serve the poor, those are federally funded spaces. And so those safety net clinics, those rural clinics often receive some form of federal funds to keep them open, because otherwise you can't care for poor people without receiving grant funds from the country as a whole. And so if we receive federal funds, many of us then are not able to provide critical medical services. So it ended up dramatically limiting access where there are providers who are very willing to provide that work. And so in order to provide that work, we then have to go work at other clinics, potentially work at a Planned Parenthood, or often travel. It makes it so that the only people who provide this service are folks who are incredibly dedicated to this work, which makes it, very meaningful, but it means that many abortion providers are traveling, flying into states where they're not welcome. And it also means that our patients have to travel for care. Whereas if we didn't have those kind of limitations, we could just provide this in our normal course of providing medical care.
I appreciate this context because it is easy to assume that if you live in a quote unquote blue state, you are in the clear. But that in itself is such a privileged understanding of reality that completely ignores the reality of what access to healthcare in this country actually looks like for those who have been and continue to be marginalized by the laws that are passed. As someone who can provide abortions but is not able to because of legislative restrictions in place, What are some possible solutions that you and other providers have been considering?
So, yeah, I think a lot of people assume that because we're in Washington, abortions are easy to access. And that's not true, actually. If you live in rural Washington, if you live in Seattle, yes, the Planned Parenthood is excellent. I used to work there. They do a really good job helping people access safe abortions. But in rural Washington, many parts of our state don't have abortion access at all. Clallam County has no mechanical abortion access. We can do pills. We have a Planned Parenthood that is capable of doing that, but we have no one who does mechanical abortions, which is really what you need for 12 weeks and on. And in truth, in practice, I prefer that from 10 weeks and on. It's a more effective option for most people, which is early. So remember, pregnancy is counted by your last period. So most people don't know they're pregnant until they're 6 weeks along at least. And so usually you've got about a 3-week window in order to get access to pills. And if you're anywhere past that, if you have irregular periods, there's a lot of folks who very easily get past that number and end up needing a mechanical abortion. So in Clallam County, we're a long straight line, and it takes about 3 hours to drive across the county, and there's just one road for most of the county. So if you want to access an abortion and you live in Nia Bay, tribal community on the farthest west end of my county, it's going to be a 3-hour drive to your nearest mechanical abortion. And many folks in Nia Bay are extremely impoverished generally. Many don't own cars. And so just having to drive means that they're not going to get it. So it's just a huge barrier to access those services. And so one of the things that we've been talking about here is how can we bring those services into Clallam County? We have many providers, myself included, who are capable of and willing to provide those services, but we work in federal centers that are covered under the Hyde Amendment. And so one thing we've started talking about is if we could set up a rotation schedule at one of our local hospitals that doesn't currently have any providers, and we could provide the willing providers and they could provide the safe space. But the challenge is we need to get the buy-in from the hospital. We need to get the buy-in from predominantly older male boards to say that this is something that they want to serve their patient population in their community. But the desire is there, and I think we can get it done. I'd love to see us move into more rural parts like Forks, where there is no such care whatsoever, but it's a challenge. Forks is a very right-wing area. We know that there's some risk in doing that, in moving our practice there. But I think it's an important service. And I guess the one blessing I could say from this leaked draft is that it's gotten people to see how important this is and really kind of raised the alarm so that we might be able to move some of these policies forward.
That would be so powerful to see happen. So you mentioned this a bit earlier in our conversation already, but could you share a bit more about who is likely to be most impacted by Roe v. Wade being overturned?
So certainly the folks we're going to see the most impacted are those already the most marginalized in our communities. We're going to see our first and most intense impacts in red states, in the South, in the Midwest, in the Southwest as well. We'll see a lot of limitations of services. We'll see many states where the procedure is likely banned outright. And that means that in those states, people with means will still access abortions. So people with money, people with time off from work, they'll fly. They'll go to a state like ours where we can access abortions more easily. But people who don't have that kind of money, working class people, people who can't get time off work, working mothers. So a majority of people who access abortion services are currently parents, and they often are accessing those services in order to protect the children they have already, but they can't get people to take care of those kids. People in desperate situations are going to not be able to access this service. And so I trained in abortion care at Johns Hopkins. We were a referral center for later abortions in the second trimester. And so whenever you see abortions that late in a pregnancy, there's always a reason. Most commonly, by far the most common cases these are desired pregnancies. But the other time we see it is very young people, children, minors who are in unsafe situations, people who are pregnant as a result of incest, people who are pregnant as a result of abuse. And people in those situations will not be able to access services. They just won't. If you're living under domestic violence, you're not going to be able to fly to a neighboring state where you could access those services. And so I think a place where people where I wish people understood more about what it's like to be pregnant in this country is I just wish more people understood how vulnerable pregnancy is. It's one of the most vulnerable times in your life. I say this as a recently pregnant person myself. It is a time that requires a lot of your body. It is an incredible strain on the human body. It is a risky time for your body. And also, in order to have a healthy pregnancy, you have to have consistent follow up. You have to go see a doctor multiple times. That is not accessible to many Americans. And so often I hear people say, well, if you don't want to have a kid, just put it up for adoption. And that ignores the profound effects on your body in those 9 months and the risk that you're taking to carry that pregnancy. But it also ignores that a safe, healthy pregnancy is not accessible to many of us, and that it's a massive economic cost to some of the most disenfranchised in our country to try to force them to do that. And that's what will happen, is we'll force them to continue pregnancies, which will be dangerous for them in a wide variety of ways. It will be an extensive economic hardship. And we will see people still try to seek abortions one way or another. They'll just become less safe.
Absolutely. Overturning Roe v. Wade will not stop abortions. It will make abortions more complicated, harder to access, and unsafe. With that in mind, what is the impact of limiting, and in some cases, eliminating, access to safe abortions?
People have always gotten abortions for basically all of human history. Ever since people started getting pregnant, there were people who didn't want to be. And so they try to figure out a way to end their pregnancies. Now, of course, in many states, Washington State being one, we're grateful to be in a place like this, abortion will remain legal. And so for those who have access to means, we're likely to see an increase in demand in our state for people who need those services. But as we discussed, for those who don't have means, they're going to be stuck where they are, trying to figure out how to access abortions. Now, there are some hopeful options right now. So there are mail order abortion pills that many people are learning how to access now, and it's getting normalized more. So Plan C is a good organization that you can, if you are in need of an abortion and it's not possible for you to access one in a clinic setting, that's available right now. So you can log on and see if you qualify depending on where you are in your pregnancy. Generally, medication abortions, which is what you would be getting in the mail, are only effective up to 11 weeks of pregnancy, and they're really most effective up to 9 weeks of pregnancy, so they don't take care of later pregnancies. I think what we'll likely see is some people trying to access those late in pregnancy, which is not safe, and will not stop the pregnancy. What we are also likely to see is people trying to access abortions other ways. So before abortion became legal, there were abortion providers who were operating under the cover of darkness, trying to provide this service. Many were legitimate and doing the best they could, but they were doing so in hotels. Pregnant people were having to be driven with blindfolds on to those spaces because it was illegal, because it was a felony, which it will be again in some states. And those will likely begin again. People will try to find a way to end their pregnancies, but they'll be doing so in unsterile environments without the kind of regulation we currently have. We talk about these unnecessary and excessive regulations that are passed in some states just to limit access. But there also are reasonable and appropriate regulations we have in places like Washington State, where you have to be board certified. You have to, meet normal quality assurance that you have to as a doctor. That's the way we want all medical care delivered. We want abortions delivered that same way. In many parts of the South, I anticipate that they'll start having just illegal abortion operations, which are less safe for the pregnant people and truly less safe for fetuses too. We'll also see more late abortions. Early abortions, when the fetus is truly just an embryo, a ball of cells, are the safest for the pregnant person. They are the simplest from a pregnancy perspective as well. And if you are concerned about embryos, if you're concerned about fetuses, you want these to happen as early as possible when they're just a cluster of cells. What will happen is that many pregnant people will have to wait until they can save money, until they can accrue enough time off of work, which means that pregnancy will progress. And pregnancy gets more and more dangerous the longer you're in it. Abortion, while an incredibly safe procedure, does increase in risk over time during your pregnancy. And so waiting until later will make the procedure more risky, the pregnancy more risky, and will lead to a more developed fetus at the time of the procedure. None of this is going to make abortion go away. None of this will make abortion safer. The safest way to have abortions is to have them well regulated and done safely by professionals who are used to doing them in safe environments. And that's the way we do it in healthcare here, as much as we can, limited as we are by the rules we already have. And that is what we hope for our patients.
Personally, I believe it's disingenuous to have a conversation about abortions without addressing the role of religion, particularly Christianity, in conversations and legislature surrounding and eliminating abortions. Growing up, what did you think about the morality of abortions?
So yeah, I was raised Catholic. And so the teaching that I grew up with was that abortion was wrong and that abortion was basically killing a child. That's what I grew up with. I was lucky in that I grew up in a Catholic church in Tacoma that is, I'd say, on the liberal spectrum of the Catholic Church. But even then, I still was raised with the idea that abortion was wrong, but that as loving Christians, we should acknowledge that women come to that decision due to circumstances, and it is not our role to judge or hate them for it. So in that way, it was really forward thinking for the church. I didn't grow up being told that women were evil, which was great. And that's the bar, apparently. But I did grow up with the idea that it would have been very wrong for me to do it. So if I needed an abortion, I was very much, I knew that I wasn't supposed to do that. And I have been lucky. I have not needed an abortion in my life, but I am very grateful that I have the option if I did. Having treated so many patients who have needed abortions, I think it's important to acknowledge that people of all religions need abortions. Catholics are actually disproportionately represented among those who get abortions. And a lot of that comes from sex ed and all of the messaging around safe sex. So if you grow up in a religion that won't allow you to teach safe sex, you are more likely to get unintentionally pregnant and to need an abortion. So I have treated people from every faith background who have needed abortion services. And I think it's important to dispel the myth of who needs abortions. There is this common idea that it's just like liberal women and they just get it, I don't know, for fun. And that's just not how it works. People get abortions for a wide variety of reasons, and all of them are fine. But I think many people don't understand how many critical reasons come up. Some people get an abortion because it's not the right time. They want to go to college. They get an abortion because they can't afford to be pregnant. But other people get abortions for really dire needs. And what I found as a provider is my patients want to tell me their stories. And I always tell them, you don't have to explain this to me. But they often feel like they need to. I think in large part because of the stigma around the procedure. I've had many patients who are very religious tell me that they never thought they would need this, but they do. And so I think it's just important to know that many people get abortions for a wide variety of reasons. And I have seen the whole spectrum of terrible reasons, terrible for the woman to experience for why they needed to get an abortion. In Baltimore, I took care of a young woman whose dad found out she was pregnant, Catholic family, tried to light her on fire when he found out that she was pregnant. I have taken care of women who are fleeing abuse. And unfortunately, in domestic violence, abuse often gets worse when you're pregnant. I've taken care of a lot of women who I remember very intensely who were aborting wanted pregnancies because of a terrible abnormality that happened. Almost universally, if you get to later term, if you get to second trimester, that was a wanted child. So the people who find themselves in those positions, they are in the most difficult time of their life. They wanted this child that feels like a child to them. That's why I use that language. But they found out something terrible. I remember a woman who found out at her anatomy scan, which is usually around 20 weeks, so that's why it's that late, that her child's brain had developed on the outside of their skull. That's not compatible with life. You can't deliver a child like that. And that was a wanted child. She wanted that baby so much. And she asked me if I could fix it, which I can't, unfortunately. And forcing her to carry that pregnancy to term and then deliver that child, which would be incredibly painful, not just to her, but actually for that child. And that child would die. Forcing her to do that is just the height of cruelty. Forcing her to feel like she's a murderer for ending a pregnancy that was never gonna end in a living child, which is the way we talk about people who get later term abortions. It was just abundantly clear to me how cruel we are when we talk about these people and how much we don't know about their stories and how much our political discourse affects how they feel about themselves. And so I think the biggest thing that I would want anyone to know is, of course, everyone has a right to end their pregnancy because they have autonomy over their body. But know that pregnancy is complicated and terrible things happen and people have to make incredibly difficult decisions. And adding a layer of stigma and political pressure and legality on top of that only makes their worst days even worse. And we need to do better by people experiencing pregnancy.
Hearing that, it's hard to have words. Reflecting on what you said, it's clear that beliefs on abortions are intricately tied to the value systems that are learned at a young age, whether through religion or otherwise. And that the inability to access safe abortions doesn't just impact any one type of person or group, it impacts all people from all walks of life. Digging deeper into the roots of the stigma associated with abortions, you mentioned that you grew up Catholic. What is the Catholic theological argument against abortions?
The Catholic argument, the one that I've come in contact with the most, is this idea that an implanted embryo from sperm and egg level is a life that's worth protecting. And so that's where a lot of the conversation breaks down, is they say, well, you can't end a life, which if you say it like that, makes sense. Agreed that you can't end lives. The complexity is that human development is much more complicated than that. What I've run into is most people think that babies start out as little miniature people. We're fully formed, fully adult human beings, but just very small. And then we grow inside of a uterus. And that's not how it works. And I truly think if more people knew about embryology, they would understand abortion. When you see a fetal heartbeat law, that's not a heart. It is a little flicker of electrical activity on a fetus that looks like an oyster. It's not a baby. It's not a heart. It looks exactly like an oyster. I do honestly think that if more people understood that, we would understand early abortion and not be so hung up about it. I think that's a basic part, is that we don't understand embryology. But I think coming back to the kind of more serious part of the church, part of it is this idea that I think is defensible, though not my idea, that fetuses are alive. And so we have to consider that life. Where I think the argument falls down and becomes deeply damaging is they just ignore the other life in the picture, which is the person carrying that pregnancy. There is a lot of ingrained misogyny in the church. And so I think what a lot of these abortion arguments come down to is this very consistent thing we've seen in the church, which is seeing women, in this case, pregnant people, but these are aimed at what the church looks at as women, seeing us as vessels. We're not people. We're not full people who have lives that are worth defending, who have bodies that we have autonomy over. That is not a position the church agrees with. They don't think that we are full people who have autonomy over our bodies. And so it becomes really easy once you start thinking that the fetus is alive and you're ignoring the fact that the woman is, to just prioritize that fetus over everything else. And I think as a theology, we have a long history of deciding that women's lives don't matter, certainly deciding that people of color's lives don't matter, that indigenous lives don't matter. And so when you see all of those things intersecting in pregnant people, pregnant women of color, it's very easy for the church and for our society to discount the value of those lives and value that fetus over everything else. I do think so much of this, I think there is a part of it that is thinking about a fetus as alive, and then a lot of it is just controlling women's bodies, which we as a people, we as a church have done for so long. And I think the argument that really brings that to the fore is that we don't take care of these kids after they're born. We only care about them when they're inside of a woman. And that shows where we are on that issue. We don't think that the women are fully capable of making their own decisions. We don't think their bodies are valuable, and we don't actually care about the well-being of the kids once they're out. If we did, the world would look very different.
Absolutely. Your point about control is incredibly important to discuss. Can you elaborate a little more on how denying abortions is about controlling the bodies of pregnant people?
When you drill down, when you start talking to folks about why they don't think people should get abortions, often they'll say, well, then they shouldn't have been having sex anyway. And it's this idea that a pregnancy, a 9-month pregnancy and a human being child is an appropriate consequence, I guess, to punish people for having sex. A lot of it comes from the church as a whole, considering sex to be a sinful act. It really comes out when we hear lawmakers talking about it. We are very comfortable as a society making decisions about women's bodies that we would never consider making about other people's bodies. And I think that comes from, in a large extent, the fact that we have lawmakers that look a certain way. For generations have had lawmakers who prioritize the needs of white land-holding men over everybody else. And that includes pregnant people. And so I think it's not a big step from our history of controlling bodies to the anti-abortion movement.
Yeah, so you talked about the importance language plays in shaping narratives around abortions, how we see people who provide abortions, and how we see people who believe access to abortions are a human right, and so forth. On this podcast, I talk a lot about the use of language and storytelling and how the words we use shape our understanding of others, especially people with differing lived experiences. I'm curious to hear how language influences how people think about abortions. For example, using the term fetus over embryo, or deciding people who are against abortions are pro-life.
Yeah, the language is very carefully chosen by the people who are anti-abortion. And I think it's also important for those of us who support abortion access to pick our language well. Certainly one of the most problematic is this idea of being pro-life. So it's really hard to argue against that. We're all pro-life. There's no position that you can take against something like that. But when you really dig into it, many people who are pro-life are pro-death penalty, which means you can't possibly be pro-life, pro-war, pro quite a few things that are not pro-life. Many Catholics actually do at least align on the death penalty and abortion, so that's one point, but many evangelicals don't. Often people refer to pregnancies as children, and that really plays into a lot of this rhetoric. So if you say that someone is killing children, that really raises people's blood pressure. That gets people on board with your cause. If you said that people are stopping 20 cells from dividing, no one's going to care. But if you phrase it as children, so that you can play into that idea that these are little perfectly formed children inside of you, that really plays into that. And I think in the pro-choice, pro-abortion access group, I think it's also really important for us to be thoughtful about our language. So one of the biggest shifts in our language has been to start talking about pregnant people, because not all people who get pregnant are women. I've delivered babies or pregnant men, so people who identify as male, but who have still delivered a pregnancy to term. So I think making sure that our speech is inclusive there is really important. And I think also speaking to this idea of reproductive justice as really the goal, not necessarily abortion, because we have a long history of forced sterilization in this country, of limiting access to safe pregnancy for people of color who are carrying pregnancies. And so I think the important thing from my end is truly reproductive justice. And that is that as a pregnant person, you have the right to decide how that pregnancy goes. You have the right to decide to end it. You also have the right to decide to continue it, and to continue it in a society that supports and makes possible a healthy pregnancy and childbearing. And that's a place where we fall down a lot when we take care of pregnant people of color.
So what is missing in conversations around reproductive justice?
I mean, I think a big part of it is that often we assume, partly because so much is in the news and there are so many terrible laws being passed to limit abortion. I think that rises to the top of our conversation, and it is important. We need to fight for it. But I think we need to fight equally for the ability of Black and brown parents to safely deliver pregnancies. Know that for many people, the thing that they want and that they are unable to access is a healthy pregnancy. as well. And so I think what really is important in these conversations is to center the autonomy of the pregnant person. It reminds me of some of our conversations about religion, right? So we'll talk about, for instance, headscarves, and apparently they're either great or they're limiting your freedoms. And the truth is, it doesn't matter. You don't get to decide what a person puts on their head. That's the point. That person gets to decide whether or not they wear a scarf. And we need to stop deciding that for them. And it's the same thing with pregnancy. If we can bring the conversation back to bodily autonomy and the autonomy of the pregnant person and their rights, that will solve so many of these problems. And if we can consider as a society the ways that we are limiting access to both of those, both healthy pregnancies and abortion, I think we can do a lot better in serving our patients as a whole.
Absolutely. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that this really is about autonomy, which many would argue is one of this country's founding principles. But somehow, in the case of abortion, that advocacy for freedom gets totally lost. Realizing that abortions are more than just political, why should we consider abortions as essential health care?
Oh, gosh, for so many reasons. But I think the biggest is that in managing a pregnancy, if you are dedicated to the life and health of pregnant people, you need to make sure that abortions are available. Pregnancy can be quite dangerous. I think in this society, we often kind of glorify pregnant people, and we have this idea that pregnancy is just this natural thing and it always works out, and it's not that big of a deal, last 9 months and then it goes away. But it has profound effects on a person's body, and it can be quite dangerous. And so at the very least, things like ectopic pregnancies, those are usually found around 6 to 9 weeks, that if not managed, will kill the parent. That will kill the pregnant person. And so if we cannot provide that service, we will lose more pregnant people. That we don't have to. We know how to stop those. Those will never become a child. But in many states, those will become illegal if this draft decision moves forward. In many cases, people develop pregnancies, like they have miscarriages that actually require a mechanical procedure, just like the one that I do, because they don't pass that on their own. And if we don't take care of that, they end up with sepsis inside their uterus. So there are many things that can go wrong in pregnancy that are incredibly dangerous to that pregnant person. And if we can't provide abortions, we will lose pregnant people. So that's a big piece of why it is essential. But I think in addition to all of those complex medical reasons, is that you as a person have autonomy over your body. We respect that in every other part of medicine. I cannot force any other procedure on you. Even if it would save your life, I can't do it. But somehow in pregnancy, many parts of our country think that it's okay to force you to go through this intensive process, which carries significant risk for you. And so if we respect the bodily autonomy of pregnant people, we have to make sure that abortions are available.
During our conversation so far, we've talked extensively about the ways in which overturning Roe v. Wade will further exacerbate existing inequalities. Taking the various intersections of oppression into consideration, how do you see racism, classism, and privilege intersect with abortion care?
Abortion care heavily intersects with racism, classism, privilege. I think so often, even in the pro-choice end of the world, people assume that people will find a way to get an abortion. And that is an incredibly privileged position that usually comes from not understanding what it's like to be poor, what it's like to not be able to meet those needs, not be able to just buy a plane ticket whenever you want to, or get a hotel room whenever you want to, which is necessary with many of these waiting periods. The inability to access basic transportation to get to a clinic is a huge barrier for so many people. The lack of paid time off to get a procedure is a huge barrier for many people. We see a lot of privilege and class structure playing out there, but I think racism plays a huge part in this. Many of the places where people are going to be most disproportionately affected by this are areas of our country where the most impoverished people are members of BIPOC populations. parts of our country in the South that are going to get hit really hard are disproportionately African American. And we, as a country, have, of course, throughout our history, focused poverty in those areas, which is now causing them to be more disproportionately affected by this. And our ability as a country and a culture to ignore the pain of impoverished people of color has allowed us to let this happen. I think this decision will be incredibly dangerous and damaging to our country. But I think many people in our country don't know how hard it already is for Black and brown people, people with limited means to access abortions. There are many parts of the country, including related to this most recent court case, where there is one clinic in an entire state. And that has already made abortion inaccessible for so many people. So, of course, I want us to fight back against this. But as we think through that, we have to think about how these rulings disproportionately affect the most vulnerable among us.
Earlier, we spoke about the Hyde Amendment and the ways in which it restricts federally funded clinics, many of which offer care to underserved communities, from offering abortion care. Nonetheless, as you mentioned, it is already incredibly difficult for individuals belonging to marginalized communities to access abortions. Can you tell us a bit about targeted regulation of abortion providers laws, commonly referred to as trap laws, and what are some of the most absurd trap laws that exist in states across the country that you know of?
Trap laws basically came in after Casey. So they basically said you can regulate abortion at any point in gestation, as long as it doesn't place an undue burden on the pregnant person. How many states that want to ban abortion have used this is to try to find a way to surreptitiously ban abortion by making it just impossible to meet these requirements. Some of the ones that I have seen is that abortion clinics or clinics that provide abortion services, again, these are usually family medicine clinics, are unable to operate unless they get certified as a surgical wing. So basically a hospital. You have to make your clinic into a hospital in order to provide these services. Again, abortion is not surgery. I've seen some that say that you have to have an anesthesiologist on staff. So abortions are generally not done with anesthesia, certainly not early abortions. So that would be prohibitive for many areas. In Clallam County, we have less than 5 anesthesiologists in total for the entire county. And I guarantee we're not going to be able to get them to sit at a family medicine clinic and do nothing, which is what they would do if we were going to have them do that. We don't have those rules in Washington, but in some parts of the country we do. Those are some of the worst that I've seen. There's a whole range. There's things requiring that you have admitting privileges at the hospital nearest you, which can sound like a good idea. But the thing is, you have hospitals and you have people who work in those hospitals. It doesn't have to be you who would admit the patient at that nearest hospital. And so what that has done, it has caused rural clinics to close who provided these services, or to stop providing these services, which was the goal. And it also made services cost prohibitive. So we are always aware as abortion providers of the difficulty in accessing our services in many states. It's difficult. These aren't covered services in many states. And so people are paying out of pocket for these procedures. So if you add an anesthesiologist, if you add all these other things, you make what was a $200, $300 procedure, a $1,000 procedure, which further makes it so that impoverished people can't access it, which is also the goal. A lot of this does come from this desire to control high-risk populations, not just women, but to control communities of color, to control impoverished communities. That is the goal of these rules. But they can fly under the radar because it sounds like you're making abortion safer. And who doesn't like that? But abortion is already safe. It's already heavily regulated. We don't need lawmakers who have no medical experience whatsoever adding regulation to this that doesn't make pregnant people safer, just makes it impossible or cost prohibitive.
You know, the thing about abortions that blows my mind is that while so many of these programs and laws on the surface market themselves as centering the interests of pregnant people on their behalf, in reality, they're designed to control and frankly prevent abortions due to religio-political motivations. Which brings us to crisis pregnancy centers, CPCs, often also referred to as pregnancy resource centers. From their name, they sound like a place that you may go to for an abortion, but in reality, they are often run by conservative, anti-abortion Christian organizations working to dissuade pregnant people from receiving abortion care. Although they are incredibly harmful and misleading, they have received millions of dollars of taxpayer funding as nonprofits. What are CPCs? Can you tell us a little bit more?
They are problematic. Centers that are designed to look like they offer abortion services. And they are specifically, some of them even copy the logo style of Planned Parenthood. Some of them are set to come up in Google searches. If you search abortion, they'll pay to make that happen. And the goal is to fool pregnant people into going into them thinking they're accessing an abortion. And then they get met with usually a highly religious messaging, deceptive messaging, inaccurate messaging. They get forced to look at ultrasounds of the fetus. They get told inaccurate things about that fetus, that it can feel everything that's happening. They get crisis intervention from a religious person. And it's all designed to trick people trying to access abortion into these spaces and try to steer them away from an abortion or make it impossible to get an abortion. There have been some crisis pregnancy centers that have been implicated in creating additional waiting periods. So they will give you enough appointments until you're past the cutoff of getting an abortion. So it's all designed to keep people from getting abortions, and it is truly deceptive and deeply concerning. A lot of times they will tout themselves as supporting pregnant people, and they'll have baby clothes and diapers and things like that. And that part could be great, but it's all within this larger milieu of trying to convince you to keep that pregnancy, which you don't want. That's why you're there. And so I think if these really were the organizations they're trying to tout themselves as being, if they were really there to support pregnant people and their children, they could just say that. They could say, we're here. If you're pregnant and you want to keep that baby, we'll help you do it. And that would be great. For those who, coming back to the reproductive justice argument, for those who need help supporting a healthy pregnancy, that would be fantastic. But that's not what these are for. They are there to lure people in who want an abortion and confuse them until they're unable to access one. And so it is important to make sure that you're accessing truly a place that offers abortions. Certainly Planned Parenthood is a real organization. If you're looking at potentially going somewhere, look it up online, potentially call ahead. Make sure you get them to say on the phone that they offer abortion services in that clinic before you go in there. And if it feels weird, if it feels like someone's trying to pressure you, get out of there. Normal abortion providers don't pressure you in any direction. We have no opinion on the outcome of your pregnancy. We are not going to try to convince you to end the pregnancy. We're not going to try to convince you to keep one. If ever a provider is giving you that impression that you need to make a decision in any direction, get out of there. And there are organizations that can help you access a real one. Good providers don't do that.
So what does this mean for Planned Parenthood clinics?
In many states, they'd have to close. Now, Planned Parenthood does provide a lot of other services, STI testing, screenings, things like that. So that could still continue. Many Planned Parenthoods in affected states are already planning to transition their services to counseling and support to help people access additional services in other states. I think that's an appropriate pivot. But in many cases, in many parts of the country, it's just going to close clinics. In Washington, we'll stay open. And I certainly think we'll see more people traveling to access services, which will make for more waits. I think people don't know that you can't always get in to get an abortion right away when you need one. So creating longer wait lists of fewer and fewer providers, fewer and fewer slots, will make more and more terminations happen later, which is riskier for patients and leads to later abortions, which those who are anti-abortion don't want.
As a public health professional, can you share in what ways overturning Roe v. Wade is a public health issue?
I do think this is a public health issue. It has major implications, not just for the health and success of that pregnant person, but also for the health and success of their children if they choose to move forward with, or if they are unable to stop a pregnancy that they can't make any choices about. Pregnancy disproportionately affects low-income women as far as reducing their subsequent economic earning potential. So we will further trap people who have already been trapped in cycles of poverty with legislation like this. And we will certainly limit some of our most vulnerable citizens' access to health. And so as such, I think it is a public health issue. And I think it's important that we as public health professionals talk about it. It is important for our patients and for the public as a whole to hear from medical professionals, public health professionals, that abortion is normal, abortion is healthcare, and that we support pregnant people accessing those services. Our patients need to know they're not alone. The public needs to know that doctors don't support this kind of legislation. I think that would really change minds. But the more that we let this be a taboo topic, that we don't talk about, that only Planned Parenthood fights for, that only women fight for, we'll never succeed if we don't bring it into the mainstream and have the doctors who do support this publicly say so.
This leads me to ask, what can we do as individuals to support abortion rights?
So it depends on your situation. Certainly, I've seen a lot of people protesting. I think that's really good. For a long time, we've been seeing people in my position or people at the hospitals that I'm trying to get to offer these services only ever hear from the people who don't want abortion to happen. And I think it's important for the people in power to see that the majority of Americans actually want access to safe and legal abortion. And so letting them see that with protest, with calling representatives, with writing letters, all of those things do make a difference because they make those decisions based on who's calling them. And so if they're only ever hearing by the anti-side, they're going to follow that, even if they don't agree with it, because that's who they're hearing from. Speaking up, talking about these issues, protesting if that's available to you. If you are a person who has experienced an abortion and you feel comfortable sharing your story, not everyone does, and I want to respect and understand that. But if you are a person who can, sharing stories is powerful. 1 in 5 people who can get pregnant will have an abortion in the United States. So we know people who have had abortions. And just like, in the early days of working on LGBTQ rights, coming out was really meaningful because people learned that someone they know is a member of this community. And so if it is safe for you to do so, and that is an important caveat, I think for those who can, sharing those real stories is very meaningful. For the providers out there, I think it's important for us to come out of the darkness and start talking about it. Let people know that we exist. We're your normal family doc down the road. The more that we normalize these things, I think does really help these conversations. And if you're in a position to donate, I would definitely encourage donating to abortion access funds. Places like Planned Parenthood are actually doing okay right now. But what is going to be a huge challenge is helping people access abortions. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to need to be able to afford a hotel stay, to afford a plane ticket, and donating to those kind of funds can make a huge difference in the life of a pregnant person who wouldn't otherwise be able to access these services. There's some good tools to find where those funds are. You can focus them to your area or to an area just passed a terrible law and you want to support the people who live there. There's a lot of ways you can help.
Absolutely. I'll be sure to include those links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Dr. Berry, for sharing your story with us. But before we part, I do want to ask you one final question. In your opinion, what does it mean to decolonize healthcare?
From a healthcare perspective, I think it is freeing our work, freeing our patients from the limitations and bounds that are placed on our patients from colonization onward. We've been built in a colonial system, which controls the bodies of pregnant people, particularly pregnant people of color. And that pervades everything that we do. It pervades the way that we approach pregnant people generally. It's why my pregnant patients of color are more likely to get a CPS referral than my white pregnant patients. It's why access to services in communities of color are often much, much less than other parts of the country. And so I think decolonizing healthcare involves looking at what the root of some of this legislation is, what some of our norms of operation are, and finding where those colonial roots are and uprooting them in our practice. And I think a key part of that is learning that history and then also looking at our patients as the truly autonomous beings that they are. And if we can get past that idea of deciding for our patients what they do, deciding for other citizens in our community what they do with their bodies, that would be one of the most critical things we could do to decolonize our services.
I want to conclude this episode by reminding everyone that access to safe abortions is a human right, regardless of class, socioeconomic status, race, gender identity, geography, and so forth. Overturning Roe v. Wade disproportionately impacts those marginalized by systems of oppression. Use your voice in protest and share your story if you feel safe to do so. Create spaces like this for critical conversations. When we take the time to deconstruct history and understand the layers of complexity that exist when addressing social inequalities, we are able to truly work towards creating a more equitable future. If you have the ability to do so, please consider donating to the National Network of Abortion Funds by visiting abortionfunds.org. For abortion providers such as Dr. Berry, speaking up can put their safety at risk. So I sincerely appreciate her bravery and support in making this episode possible. With that, I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This podcast is entirely listener supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting patreon.com/Manpreet Kaur. To learn more about Art of Citizenry, please visit artofcitizenry.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Manpreet Kaur. Please remember to subscribe to the Art of Citizenry podcast on your favorite listening app and give it 5 stars in iTunes. From here on Duwamish land, sending positive and healthy vibes your way.